no matter where you turn, there's like a nosode for every problem now. And we want to talk about that. Hahnemann was not anti-nosode. Nosodes are remedies just like anything else, and they have indications for use. I use them when they're indicated. If the case calls for it, you give the remedy in the same way you would give any other remedy.
Thanks for tuning in to Season 4 of Strange, Rare, and Peculiar Homeopathy Podcast, where homeopathy lives, breathes, and evolves with Denise Straiges and Alastair Gray. We'll be exploring modern practice, research, and philosophy, from Hahnemann's radical insights to today's breakthroughs and discoveries. Get ready for homeopathy woes, feedback from pros, and the more you knows.
Hi everybody, Alastair Gray here. It is time for our podcast. I am the Academic Director at the Academy of Homeopathy Education and the Research Director at the Institute for the Advancement of Homeopathy. Welcome, welcome. Who are you?
I am Denise Straiges, and I'm really glad you're here. I am the President and Clinical Director of the Academy of Homeopathy Education and the Institute for the Advancement of Homeopathy. We are a not-for-profit dedicated to truth in homeopathy. We are an advocacy organization. We are a not-for-profit, a 501c3 charity, and our mission is around education, clinical services, research, and raising money for scholarships in homeopathy. And we curate this gorgeous library that Al has taken on as his very own background, which I love.
You're welcome. And today we're going to talk about poop. Specifically, English poop. English poop.
Oh, right.
English poop from the 1920s.
Okay, so we're here to talk about poop. Like no matter where you turn, there's like a nosode for every problem now, and we want to talk about that.
And how far 62 million miles that is away from homeopathy.
Oh, gosh. So it's going to be kind of the framework of the discussion, and the reason it matters is because homeopathy is this unbelievably incredible and advanced system of medicine. It's based on universal laws. Universal laws don't change. So when people say, well, if Hahnemann lived another however many years, he would have changed it, I would argue that he might have tweaked it. But in the same way that Newton was able to identify the principles around gravity, Hahnemann did for medicine. So just because we can get a guy to the moon or send satellites up to be able to deliver us back our Starlink it doesn't change the principle of gravity. In the same way, the way that the human condition has changed doesn't change the universal laws on which homeopathy is based.
It existed before, it existed before and during, and then after its discovery, right?
Exactly. So by the end of today's podcast, what I want you to come away with is there's a misappropriation of homeopathic principles being seen through the lens of a whole different set of principles around bacteriology and virology. And we are going to include primary source materials in order to demonstrate the ways in which contemporary homeopathy has walked far away from how some of these remedies were intended to be used. So we're going to talk about bowel nosodes. And so the bowel nosodes, which basically it's like, everybody, let's do home fecal transplants. They have been misappropriated. And so, but the initial discovery or sort of system was started by Edward Batch. Some people call him Bach. He's the flower essence guy. And then it was taken to the next level by a married couple called the Patersons. And we're going to talk about them in a bit. And so I thought that because I thought we should just have a conversation, more conversation around sort of nosodes and also the guidelines for safety and things. Right? First, I want to dispel a mythology because I was told this week that I don't use nosodes.
A myth.
A myth.
The ology is the study of the myth.
Oh.
So it's a myth.
What about when when other people share the information? Does it then become mythology? Has it been mythologized?
That part I have no idea about.
Yeah. It's kind of like obtuse and obtund. What is the exact difference? Anyway, so nosodes, just for those of you who might be stepping into this going, wait, vocabulary lesson. So a nosode is a remedy that is made from a product of disease. And nosodes are good when they're used according to principles. And Hahnemann was not anti-nosode. So I always feel like, we got to go to the primary source. And so what Hahnemann said, it surprises me that I don't know the footnote to 56 by heart at this point. But Hahnemann is talking about, it's actually a really good footnote because it deals with isopathy. It has a little epidemics worked into it. And it also talks about nosodes.
Why don't you read the whole thing? I like the part about calamity.
Okay, I'll read the whole thing. It's not too long. There are those who would like to create a third application of medicines against disease through isopathy, as it is called, namely the cure of a present disease with the same miasm. But even granted one could do this, isopathy would nevertheless only produce a cure through a similimum as opposed to the similimo. But this wanting to cure through an entirely identical disease potence contradicts all healthy common sense and therefore all experience. Those who first broached the subject of so-called isopathy presumably had hovering before them the benefit which humanity received through cowpox inoculation. Those who were inoculated remained free from all future smallpox infection and were cured of the disease in advance, as it were. So we're going to also touch on homeoprophylaxis in a little bit because it overlaps beautifully with the nosode conversation. Anyway, and so Hahnemann is saying here, he's dispelling the exact curing exact or prophylactically addressing the exact, but rather through the similar. And he goes on to say, but cowpox and smallpox are only very similar. They are in no way entirely the same disease. They differ in many respects, namely in that cowpox has a more rapid course and is gentler, and especially in that cowpox never infects the human being through proximity. Widespread inoculation with cowpox so effectively put an end to all epidemics of the deadly, terrible smallpox that the present generation has no vivid conception of that former horrible smallpox plague. In this way, to be certain, now this is really important, in this way, to be sure, certain other animal diseases will present us with medicinal and curative potencies. So in other words, nosodes, for very similar important human diseases, happily supplementing our stock of homeopathic medicines. Agreed. There are amazing nosodes that act on similar diseases beautifully and can be effective. Now, we're going to call a caveat to this because I think one of the things about healthy discussion is that you engage with outliers, right? If you have a bell curve, you're always going to have outliers. And we're going to talk about how we can challenge this conversation around leptospirosis. And we'll talk about what happened, right, in Cuba. What year was that? 2007?
2007.
2007. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. But we're just kind of going here, just talking about what Hahnemann is saying about nosodes. Okay. Then he says, nosodes, they're going to be good. Like, we need to know more about them, and they will provide us with more opportunities to cure similar diseases. He says, but wanting to cure a human disease, and he gives the example here of the itch diathesis or maladies arisen therefrom, with an identical human disease matter, e.g. with a soricum taken from the itch diathesis, is going too far. Exclamation point. Nothing results from it but calamity and aggravation of the disease. So I think when we start there, right, that is, if we're looking at homeopathy as a system of medicine that has foundational premises, it has a philosophical, unmoving philosophical paradigm. It's based on similarity. And Hahnemann gives us all these examples about how that happens in nature, the luminous moons of Jupiter, and in disease. A stronger, similar disease will annihilate the weaker disease already in the system. And you can find all of that in your organon. Read from, say, aphorism 24 to 49, all of the principles of similar, dissimilar disease, what cures, what doesn't cure, and so forth. Okay, so that's one thing. The second thing is, do we, just to clear the myth, I use them when they're indicated in the same way I might use anacardium, or lachesis, or plutonium nitricum, or rustux. If the case calls for it, you give the remedy in the same way you would give any other remedy. Would you, what do you have anything to add to that?
No. So
yeah. So I think that let's leave the nosodes good, bad thing out, right? So nosodes are just like any other remedy. And we're going to talk about the bowel nosodes in a minute, right? Because they're a part of this category. They are remedies just like anything else, and they have indications for use. Now, The bowel nosodes, though, are a little bit different because of how they were discovered, the premises under which they were discovered, and the very clear guidelines for their use, which actually differ somewhat, not totally, but somewhat from how we might engage with another homeopathic remedy. And that's what we need to talk about, right? So Edward Batch, so he's the first person to work on the bowel nosodes, and he wasn't a homeopath. He was a bacteriologist, and he was working in the hospital as a bacteriologist or virologist. And then he leaves the project, and I'm going to leave Batch out of it, and we're going to pick up with the Patersons who took Batch's work, and then they went with it. I'm just going to start with a primary source, and I'm going to tell you where you can find it. So this isn't me. This isn't my opinion, and there's no opinion. This is John Paterson, who, along with his wife, tested 20,000 stool samples.
That's a lot of poop.
It's a lot of poop. And it started out as an auto-inoculation idea. So put it into context, because this is in the early 20th century. This is the heyday of virology and bacteriology and the causation of disease. And with Batch, with the Patersons, and with a gazillion other physicians, they were looking to understand pathogenic material. What causes what? And so one of the things that was happening at that time is they were looking at people's stool and saying, is there a change from healthy stool to stool of someone who is sick? And can you, by extracting pathogenic material, identify what the change is? And then they did some really interesting things. They said, oh, you can give that back to the person and they're going to have a positive reaction. They also said these remedies, so there are no provings from Paterson's on the bowel nosodes, but what they did was they looked at sort of the archetypal symptoms of different remedies, and they put them into groupings, and they said, okay, Morgan is going to be like this group, and Proteus is going to be like this group, and so on and so forth. So they created an analogous relationship between homeopathic remedies, primarily, interestingly enough, anti-miasmatic remedies, anti-psoriatic remedies, created a relationship between those and a particular nosode. And there was a question because they weren't homeopaths, and Batch wasn't a homeopath. He was given the organon, and he was like really interested in this, but what they were trying to figure out was, is there a way to turn around psoriatic disease through this process, which I think is really, it was an interesting exploration and an interesting point in time where the history of medicine and the history of homeopathy post-Hahnemann intersected. Okay. So what happens is he gives a famous warning, Paterson. He says, do not repeat a bowel nosode within 3 months. Now you will find this in the British Homeopathic Journal, 1950. Okay. And I have the exact, I can give you all the information, but he says, I'm quoting here, quoting directly from the person who created these medicines. He says, I quote, one last remark, and that of warning, do not repeat a bowel nosode within 3 months. But if it is necessary to prescribe, in other words, you need to give another remedy, select a remedy within the group. So in other words, they've created these groups. These remedies look like each other. They do similar things. So you'll find like some of them have a lot of carbonate, some of them have a lot of murate, some of them have a liver affinity, whatever. They'll select a remedy within the group and give the remedy in high or low potency as you find indicated from the symptoms present. So just to be clear, this is not Denise or Al saying this. And again, not saying nosode's bad, nosode's good, nothing, just primary source material. The person who did this, who studied 20,000 stool samples, says, one last remark, and that of warning, do not repeat a bowel nosode within 3 months. I mean, it's pretty clear. And so then he gives a biological reason for why he wouldn't repeat. And he says, I'm quoting here again, if I find a percentage of non-lactose fermenting organisms in a stool greater than 50%, I at once determine the administration of a bowel nosode is contraindicated. And then he continues and he says, experience has shown that a nosode given at such a time produces a negative phase with a corresponding period of vital depression in the patient. Quoting from the primary source, okay? People are given, okay, take this for a month or take 2 of them or 3 of them. Yeah. So he says, I'm just going to read this again, primary source material from Paterson, the guy who used 20,000 stool samples, who came up with this, who wrote the seminal art, like this is his project, right? If I find a percentage of non-lactose fermenting organisms in a stool greater than 50%, I at once determine that the administration of a bowel nosode is contraindicated.
And how would you determine that?
Stool sample. He was working in a lab. So
wait, so I can do that? I can gather stool samples from all of my clients to determine
absolutely.
bowel nosodes?
Absolutely. They're going to have to come. It's like that thing you do, Cologuard, where you don't have to go and get a colonoscopy if you're not at risk. You just poop in a box and send it away.
Poop in a box.
Poop in a box. You can poop in a box. And so he could experience has shown that a nosode given at such a time produces a negative phase with a corresponding period of vital depression in the patient. How does he know this? Because he had 20,000, not 2, 20,000 cases, patients in the hospital where they extracted the fecal material. So his entire system depended on serial stool cultures. So in his paper, just if you want to read his seminal papers, you can just look it up. I mean, it's not difficult to find. I didn't have the book. The book is living over where Al is, and I'm in my office at the bottom of the garden. And I was working on preparation, so I just Googled it. It wasn't that hard. I found exactly what I have in the book. So in the introduction, Paterson summarizes more than 12,000 bacteriological examinations, and he explains how the bowel flora changes after the administration of the indicated remedy. So he reports on stool cultures before treatment. He repeats the cultures after treatment. He observes changes in non-lactose fermenters, and he correlates that with a remedy response. This is the laboratory foundation of the bowel nosodes. So this is not guessing. Okay. Now, then he writes a special section, indications for the use of the bowel nosodes in disease. And he says, my remarks will be addressed to those doctors who have no means of obtaining bacteriological reports on stool culture. So he's demonstrating it's the preferred method. And the remainder of the chapter is guidance for physicians to work without laboratory confirmation. And basically, that's why he says, don't repeat in 3 months. That's coming from if you don't have access to this, then the only way to ensure safety is to assume that a 3-month interregnum is going to be sufficient for not producing an undesirable pathological response.
And we're the fuddy-duddies. Fuddy-duddies.
I know. You know what? I have never been referred to as a fuddy-duddy or a person who's like against stuff. How did I become that person? I thought I was like, I don't know.
Well, here's how. 1, you read. 2, you critically think. And 3, you check your sources and your primary sources.
I would actually start by saying I teach, and I teach people who are smarter than me who ask me questions, and I can't just go like, oh, because I said so.
Yeah, right.
Because we don't teach a culture of like a cult. Oh, culture and cult come from the same root word. Interesting. Never thought about that. But it's not about us and what we say. I mean, yeah, we've got tons of clinical experience, right? But it's not a guru culture over here at AUG. It's like there are authorities on this work, and we then test everything that we're doing against the clients that we see. And we're really lucky, I think, for us, because we work in this clinical environment and in the teaching clinic, we've got thousands of cases. And so, we're able to look at this. Anyway, but just to be clear, the bowel nosodes, because they came from a hospital setting, they were never introduced as detox remedies, drainage remedies, constitutional clearers, miasmatic clearers, or routine protocol medicines. They were only selected to be given after a clinical assessment, a bacteriological evaluation, and quote unquote constitutional prescribing.
Excuse me, miss.
Yes, sir.
Can I, it's irrelevant, but the name of a remedy, which is my absolute favorite?
Disco. Dysentery code, disco. Me too. Give me 5 across the screen. Woo!
I never
That's
knew.
why I said, how could I feel not cool? I mean, I spent a lot of years in the disco, Studio 54 area,
Yeah.
and then, danceteria, all the things.
Dysentery compound. Disco.
Disco. And by the way, I've given bowel nosodes but not like to everybody. Do you remember I did that survey? Were you around? I was teaching for a school where there was somebody who was a bowel nosode like Pez. And I thought, well, maybe I'm just missing out because I want to know. And so I called all the people who I really respect in homeopathy, like people who have great experience. I reached out to them. Like I reached out to Jeremy Scher, for example. And I was like, yo, how often do you prescribe a bowel nosode? And at that time, I haven't asked him recently if he's had a radical departure, but he said maybe once or twice a year. Years could go by where you don't. Depends on what you get. It's just like years could go by where you don't prescribe anacardium or, I don't know, what was the other examples I used before? Plutonium, Ristox, right? So Paterson, he was like, these are incredible, these medicines. He saw that they actually were active, so much so that he limited their use because he said they're deep acting. They can alter the bowel flora. They can have prolonged effects. And they're capable of harm. That's why he said, do not repeat within 3 months. Like, how do you square that circle? So if somebody who's just like on the webinar circuit is telling you do all of this stuff, or the combination remedies that have bowel nosodes within them, or the protocols of bowel nosodes, that combo that I'm always talking about that has 70 different things. It has, let me grab it, because it has 2 different bowel nosodes in different potencies. So it's got, oh no, I tell a lie. It's got Proteus Morgani in 30C and 200C in this combo. And it's got 2 different potencies to be taken 3 times a day in a 30-day cycle.
Oh,
yeah.
All right.
So
that's radical.
One of the reasons that I wanted to talk about this is because there's a really interesting sort of intellectual history here, which is you sort of have to take all this stuff in its own terms, right? So this is all a part of the evolution of bacteriology. It's not the evolution of homeopathy. So like Batch, right? So Batch comes along and he writes he's got an article, The Relation of Vaccine Therapy to Homeopathy. He wrote this in 1920, and it was published in the British Homeopathic Journal, 10, 1920, pages 67 to 81. Okay. And so his central argument here is disease is not the invading organism. And this is really interesting because this is leading us to where we're going to talk about kind of this idea of prophylaxis and so forth. So disease is not just the invading organism, because each patient will have a different reaction to any organism. And therefore, a treatment needs to address the patient rather than destroy the bacteria. So that was part of the foundational premise. So the idea was to alter, the ecosystem, which I think is cool. So then Batch goes further and he publishes an article in Intestinal Toxemia in its Relation to Cancer. This was in 1924, also published in the British Homeopathic Journal, 14, 355 to 363. And here it's really interesting because he's arguing these incredible points that are there. You've got to see them through the lens of homeopathy, and then you have to see them as they relate to the bacteriology, because he's saying chronic intestinal disturbances have systemic consequences. He's not saying treat the gut. He's just looking at the relationships between intestinal bacterial populations, chronic illness, and constitutional susceptibility. So this is the difference here, is that you've got really super careful pathological observation, not protocol medicine. Now, a year later, Batch writes an article he co-authors with somebody called C.E. Wheeler and H.K. Lewis. And this is Chronic Disease, a Working Hypothesis.
Yeah, 1926. Yep.
25, 26. Do you have the book there?
No, I got Winston.
Okay. So this is this bridge between bacteriology and homeopathy. Okay. Now I want to make a jump here because it goes on. There are repeated attempts, intellectual exercises to figure out how this idea of bacteriology and homeopathy can be seen through the same lens, which is cool. right? It's an investigative question. And so what I would like to do for the last half of the podcast is to propose a couple of questions that we can ask going forward, right? Because Batch never, like the Patersons, never advocated for routine detox, rotating bowel nosodes, daily or monthly administration, lifelong maintenance, none of that stuff. Simultaneous use of multiple bowel nosodes. He was constantly emphasizing careful case analysis, laboratory investigation, all of that, chronic prescribing, and so forth. Okay. And so this is what I want to talk about. So first of all, I mean, I'm super interested in the contingent evolutions, like how do people in homeopathy overlap with the scientific advances at any given time? So Batch and Paterson are some of the earliest physicians thinking about intestinal microbial ecology and chronic disease. I think that's amazing. Right? What's happened is that fast forward 100 years. So we've got in the 1920s, the heyday of the discoveries around germ theory, right? Bacteriology and all of this sort of an investigation that Batch and the Patersons did. And then they kind of sat there. And then it's got this resurgence in the early 2010s. So I think we should think about a couple of things. I'm going to put a little pause here and talk about this idea of homeoprophylaxis. Because on one hand, bowel nosodes are not used prophylactically, I don't think. I mean, I suppose they could be.
No, but it's important that people realize that they're used not based on their proving data, but on their bacteria data, right?
It was comparative. So what they did was they looked at all of the remedies that do a similar thing. So if a person was under chronic homeopathy care and they got their stool tested, there would be sort of a category of remedies that would have been indicated for the, what they were referring to as constitutional prescription. I would say it's more of a chronic prescription. But the idea is that there are groupings of remedies, and then you can sort of apply a bowel nosode there. And fair enough. I don't think that's the end of the world. I think the idea is that it's a gut detox remedy or whatever. That's a whole different story. All right, we've got this sort of an irony, right? Where people are justifying the frequent giving of bowel nosodes because of microbiome science and gut health and dysbiosis, right? But what's interesting is that the people who discovered them, I would argue, just given the quality of the work they did and like the overlap with homeopathy, they became more conservative. So basically they're like, if you're giving a remedy and the bowel is changing, leave it alone. I think that's kind of cool. Anyway, okay, the other thing that I wanted to talk about though was the conversations about nosodes are becoming like, like someone telling me, you don't use nosodes, you're afraid of them. I was just like, I'm not. I mean, it's just objectively not true. But it's about the use of the nosode, right? So I would use it just as anything else. But I think there is this other idea about how nosodes can be deployed. And one of the first places that people encounter it is through the lens of homeoprophylaxis. And so what I would like to do is I want to approach this from intellectual history, not a critique. We can just look at all of the publications. There are tons of publications out there. And so you've got somebody like Isaac Golden, who is considered to be he's got a scheduled program, a formal long-term prophylactic program, and he's been doing it since the 80s. And he states that he collected outcome data in children, and he developed first a 5-year program for the long-term prevention of targeted infectious diseases. And he turned that into a doctorate. Okay, that's great. But there are a couple of things that I feel like we just need to like ask questions about. And so I'd like to use the last couple of minutes to pose some questions that we can come back and talk about next time. So Al, because I think we've got some great success stories like leptospirosis. Will you just talk a little bit about that? And then we'll use that as a launch point to talk about prophylactic interventions.
Okay, so that's an example where a nosode is used prophylactically, right? And so every time it rains in the Caribbean, there's a chance that there's going to be followed by a hurricane. And when that happens, usually after a hurricane, there's an outbreak of leptospirosis, which is a animal-borne disease transferred from rat urine, I believe. And in 2007, believe it or not, someone looked in the cupboard and the cupboard was bare at the Finley Institute in Cuba, which was where the millions of units of orthodox vaccination were stored. And I'd love to know how that actually happened, how the cupboard was bare. Maybe the rats got it or something. But it's an interesting institute because they make both conventional medicines and also prepare homeopathically prepared medicines as well. So they very quickly bashed out around 10 million units of leptospirosis and homeopathic potency. And that was given to anybody that had a pulse in 2 states on the west of Cuba. Whereas in the rest of the country, and I can't actually, this is something I cannot remember. I don't recall if they got the conventional medication or if they got nothing. I actually don't remember that very important point about the story. Anyway, and then the hurricanes hit, and then they waited for the leptospirosis, and it never came. And the incidences, the graphs are unbelievably dramatic as to what happens every year with the leptospirosis outbreak. And in the year of 2007 and in 2008, the following year, complete control and management of the incidences of leptospirosis from the application of a remedy in a potency where there's nothing in there, it shouldn't happen, should not be a biological response.
Well, forget about that, because we're trying on a homeopathy podcast, right? But the idea though is the nosode, because it was a nosode that was effective in the prophylaxis. So this is effective, right? Because like if you're gonna have a conversation that isn't just based on opinion, then you need to be really clear. So I feel like there are questions that need to be asked, because this idea of homeoprophylaxis. So first of all, someone who is, let's say, selling or believing in homeoprophylaxis, they will say Hahnemann believed in homeoprophylaxis. And I would say that is true. However, Hahnemann said, in the face of clear and present danger, you give the remedy that you understand to be the best indicated remedy for that particular disease. And the example he gives is for scarlet fever, where he gave belladonna the first time comes around. And he even gave instructions for use. And so if belladonna is in your house and it's the remedy that, and now we get into epidemic theory, which we can talk about, but if belladonna was the genus epidemicus, in other words, the indicated remedy for scarlet fever, not scarlet fever nosode, but rather belladonna, it fit the signs and symptoms of the disease. Okay.
A homeopathic remedy.
A homeopathic remedy.
Yep.
So what Hahnemann says is, and he gave out, they would give vials of belladonna along with instructions for its use. If scarlet fever is to come to your house or your village or down your block, then you take this prophylactically. And great. He didn't say you should take the disease. He already dispelled in aphorism 56, nothing results but calamity of the disease. So there's already a contraindication for the use of nosodes. But we have this leptospirosis success story.
Well, there's plenty. There's plenty. The most dramatic ones are actually, and this is interesting. No, I wasn't expecting to go here, but there's been various dengue outbreaks in Brazil throughout the 70s and the 80s. And the public health application of either eupatorium or dengue nosode have been widespread with pretty spectacular results. And there's an example of either using the homeopathically prepared remedy or the nosode. Anyway.
Okay, so here's the thing that I want to play through is I wonder if there's a difference when there's an endemic disease. Because one of the things that the larger investigations of homeoprophylaxis are not considering, to what I can find, please, if there's data otherwise, I would love to see it, but all diseases are as if equal. So in other words, measles, mumps, chickenpox, smallpox, plague, dengue, leptospirosis, Coxsackie virus, Zika virus, herpes virus, everyone as if the same, and an assumption that everyone needs the nosode and that children should get a series of nosodes, or in a study that's being done now, pregnant women, children, babies and children, a series of nosodes to prevent from the eventual development of disease or to strengthen the immune system. That may in fact be true. I think there are questions I want to ask, because Hahnemann, he differentiated between different types of diseases. So they're the fixed miasmatic diseases. He says they occur in roughly the same way, enough so that they warrant a name. Because remember, Hahnemann says, you don't, just because it's marsh fever, don't call it all marsh fever, say a type of marsh fever, so that you can communicate about the symptom pattern. Same with Sydenham's chorea, same with, he gives a whole list. It's in, where's my organon? Is it in 260, 180 names of diseases?
No idea.
Hang on here. 180. Anyway, I will find it. But he says, no, I'm having a little glitch here. I'm remembering which. Here we go. No, 260 is the what not to do. Anyway, Hahnemann talks about named diseases, right? Don't get lazy and prescribed on a named condition, because it's not about the causation. So one of the questions I have, is there a difference between endemic disease, right? An endemic disease is an illness that's consistently present and maintained at a baseline level within a specific geographic area or population. And if you have long-term or seasonal vaccination, are you basically just energetically continuing the same protocol? I don't know. I think it's an interesting question. Another question I would like to pose is, what about diseases that, like, if we look at diseases as being sort of their own entity, right? Disease specific, it flies in the face of the sort of homeopathic thinking, but that's fine. But I think we need to question the concept of disease, because we're making an assumption that diseases are like sufficiently stable entities that can be prevented through disease-specific preparations administered in advance.
Are you talking about homeoprophylaxis to kids in this instance?
To kids, or yeah, and mostly to kids, just because that's how most of us know about it. But it's being used so much now, right? But like, what if we're reading it through Hahnemann's lens? Like, disease is a disturbance of the living organism. It has to do with susceptibility and host response. It has to do with your constitutional state, your miasmatic state. And this is where I think we're learning more. It's about symbiosis. How are we in harmony or not in harmony with our environment? But what about, this is sort of theoretical, and I think there's so much more to talk about. And again, not being negative about one theory or another, because we've seen already in the leptospirosis and dengue fever examples that it has worked. But let's say, for example, a question to ask: can a fixed prophylactic schedule remain philosophically coherent if susceptibility is continually evolving? And not just susceptibility of the individual, but let's say the planet. Because if we just look at like COVID, for example, part of the reason that there was this giant response is because it was what is called a novel virus. And so after a time, if our whole sort of worldview of health is that we are in symbiosis with our environment, at a certain point, have we not done the evolutionary work of becoming more harmonized with these pathogens? In other words, do we have to fight against or take a medicine for something like diphtheria? If diphtheria has already gone through its life cycle and it's going to come through in an altered state, if it were to come through again, it would be completely different. Or does that speak more toward the idea of homeoprophylaxis, because if it comes back in an altered state, but again, it doesn't face the clear and present danger idea? I guess what I'm saying is, if I go back to my research on the intellectual history of homeopathy and Hahnemann's discoveries, it's based on this idea, like a homeopathic remedy speeds up evolution to get you through the suffering faster to achieve homeostasis in a much more efficient way. Yeah. And if you've got a pathogen coming in the face of clear and present danger, you can head it off at the pass by having the energetic response already there. Hahnemann and Belladonna. But Hahnemann already showed us when when scarlet fever came through a second time, he said, oh, actually, not belladonna this time, but aconite. Cholera, he had 3 different remedies for 3 different stages of the disease. And so
Okay, so your critique, if I understand you right, one of your critiques is that it's not dynamic enough given the dynamic nature of epidemic disease as it comes through. And perhaps there's other better prophylactic possibilities or remedies.
Well, or just the way that Hahnemann said, in the face of clear and present danger.
Yeah,
So
right.
is individualized treatment going to get us further with less? I don't know, because the thing that I think about is that which does not cure proves. So if you're taking a remedy for which you do not have the symptom picture, is it going to potentially give you proving symptoms? I just think I think that these are interesting conversations to have. And I like
on that last one, I think it's a pretty legitimate point. The thing about the protocol, if you're going to talk about that children's protocol, I must have sold, I'm going to say 500 of those kits to mums. And I did that mainly because I knew that if I didn't sell them, then they'd go down the road and get it somewhere else. And so not one of those 500 mums finished the protocol. Because what inevitably happens is that they start on month 1 or 2 or 3, and then there's a reaction, or then there's a snot or a flu or a diarrhea or a something. And it got really confusing for the mum and myself as to what to do next, because they're not being used homeopathically. These remedies are creating responses and reactions. Now, Isaac talks about that in his manual on homeoprophylaxis for practitioners. That's the one that I wrote the forward for. And he doesn't see that it's a big drama, but for me, the practicalities of it were that I don't think I've ever seen anyone go through the whole protocol. Because it's a long time. It's 72 or 84 months or something like that. It's a long time.
So we're going to have to stop just because I have an appointment. But I think there's a lot more to say. And I want to stop by saying, again, what we're here to do is to talk about homeopathy and understand it on its own terms, and to use primary source materials to reach better conclusions about how to deploy these medicines safely, effectively, and to do well in the long term. We're not judging. We're just asking questions. I think that there are a lot of questions asked so that we can get better. But when it comes to things like bowel nosodes, for example, and you've got clear information that of contraindicated practice, then I think those are conversations that need to be had. Now, when it comes to something like homeoprophylaxis, I think there are a lot of really cool conversations to have, because epidemiology and all of sort of the ways in which that we are evolving as a species, the interconnectedness of us with the different kingdoms, I think it's really cool. But like, do we answer it through chronic diseases? Because that's how we're solving the problem, right? Is by digging deeply into the Hahnemannian canon of information and having the outcomes that we're measuring that are really good. Or do you go scattershot and go in a way that, as we looked at in the footnote to 56, Hahnemann says is contraindicated? It doesn't fit the guidelines of homeopathy. That doesn't make it bad. It just makes it different and sitting outside of it and worthy of conversation. And as we wrap up, if you've made it this far, we totally appreciate you. And if you enjoyed it, like, follow, subscribe, tell a friend. Hey, thanks for being here. We really appreciate you. Take care.
Ciao.
See ya.
AHE is changing the face of homeopathy education by raising the bar through rigorous academics and unparalleled clinical training delivered live through the soulful use of cutting-edge technology. AHE prepares its students to become fully rounded homeopathic practitioners from anywhere in the world. Apply today at ahe.online.